The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Mr. Connolly for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, we will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute each. We will then hear from our witnesses. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. And without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Over 2 years ago, the improbable happened. Millions of Egyptians filled Tahrir Square and streets all across Egypt, demanding the end of the Hosni Mubarak regime and ushering in of a new democratic era, an era that would be free of government corruption, free of police brutality, an era that would allow all Egyptians to exercise their freedoms of speech, expression, assembly, and religion. But as we all know, the transition to a true democracy is often an arduous task that takes time and commitment, and it must be responsive to the goals and aspirations of those who facilitated the change. The Egyptian transitional government's treatment of pro-democracy groups like Freedom House, IRI, NDI, and groups that promote free independent press like ICFJ was in direct contradiction with the principles of democracy and incongruous with the goals of the revolution. It is clear by last week's verdict, Morsi's refusal to drop the charges, and the new NGO law, that the freedom for these groups to work will only be further restricted under the Muslim Brotherhood-led government. These institutions and their employees all believed in the cause of freedom and democracy. They believed in the aspirations of millions of Egyptians who wished to cast off the oppressive yoke of totalitarianism and establish a free and open society. But the Egyptian government feared that the people might soon turn against the government in the people's pursuit to end corruption and bring real democratic reforms. So the Egyptian authorities ransacked the offices of these NGOs, arrested their employees, seized their assets, and shut down their operations. It was hoped that the Egyptian officials would soon see the error of their ways and drop the charges and allow the NGOs to continue their work. However, last week, all 43 defendants were convicted and sentenced in a case that had no basis in the rule of law. This verdict was politically driven and not just an attack on these American NGOs, German NGO, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, or their employees who come from countries like USA, Germany, Serbia, Norway, Lebanon, Romania, and many other places. This verdict was an indictment on the Morsi regime's assault on freedom, on human rights, on democracy, and the Egyptian people themselves. We must stand in solidarity with those who continue to seek the ideals of the revolution. It is no longer acceptable to send unconditional aid to a regime that persecutes, prosecutes, and convicts those who seek to aid Egyptians seeking freedom and true democracy for all of Egypt. To seek further reforms, I have introduced H.R. 416, the Egypt Accountability and Democracy Promotion Act. This bill would condition our economic assistance to Egypt in order to advance U.S. national security interests by ensuring that Egypt protects freedom, protects human rights, the rule of law, civil society organizations, and upholds the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty. Because if we don't condition our aid, we risk sending the wrong message yet again to countries in the region and around the world that the United States will not only tolerate this unabashed attack on democratic values, but we will not hold these violators accountable for their repressive actions. When I was chair of the full Foreign Affairs Committee, the administration wanted to send over $500 million in taxpayer money, American taxpayer money, to Morsi. I placed a hold on this because of the repressive actions of the Muslim Brotherhood-led government and because of its crackdown on civil society and the rule of law. And I was disappointed to hear Secretary Kerry announce earlier this year in Cairo that the United States would provide an additional $250 million in assistance to Morsi in economic support funds. We cannot afford to send a mixed message at this delicate juncture. We must send a strong, unified signal if we are to see Egypt realize the goals of the revolution. The United States must call on Morsi to immediately pardon all 43 individuals and allow the NGOs to reopen without further harassment from government authorities. We must also impress upon him the importance of abandoning his proposed NGO law that would restrict the operations of NGO groups across Egypt even further, allowing for the possibility of even more of these sham trials to occur. And we must insist that the Muslim Brotherhood-led government implement real democratic reforms or risk losing U.S. assistance. The choice is clear. And with that, I'm proud to call upon Mr. Connolly for his opening statement. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Madam Chairman. And let me join with you in the expression of sentiments of grave concern, if not disgust, at the recent developments in Cairo. The issue of the NGOs is not only a test for Egypt, it's actually a test for the United States. Will we support institutions we have helped create to promote democratization in emerging societies, not just the American employees of those NGOs, but the Egyptian employees as well, who are at great risk? They must know, from the halls of Congress to the executive branch, that they are not being abandoned and that we are as concerned about their fate as we are or would be were an American on trial. I was in Egypt last May, almost exactly a year ago. At the time, Field Marshal Tantawi was still in office, and we had had a meeting with the Egyptian employees of the NGOs represented at this table. I was struck, Madam Chairman, with how highly educated and highly motivated these people were. They cared about their country. They cared about its future. They cared about trying to contribute to the democratization of institutions that were just emerging in the post-Mubarak era. And frankly, what has happened, what was happening then and what has happened now, were some officials, including the official at the time, Faiza Abu Naga, a demagogue of the first order, a woman trying to prove that her previous association with the previous regime somehow had been cleansed at the expense of these NGO workers. Our delegation, led by our former colleague David Dreyer, made it very clear to General Tantawi at the time that this issue would be a major sticking point in bilateral relations if not resolved. He was surprised that it was elevated to that level of concern, and every member of our delegation, Republican and Democrat, reiterated that position. Here we are a year later, and we now have the guilty verdicts. I have long believed that the U.S.-Egyptian relationship, as I know you do too, Madam Chairman, is a critical one. In the Middle East, critical as a cornerstone, obviously, in the Camp David Accords, critical in the evolution of the so-called Arab Spring. Egypt is the largest Arab country. Outcomes there matter. The Muslim Brotherhood is struggling with how to emerge as a democratic force in civil society, and I understand that. And some patience is going to be required. But these verdicts are a huge impediment in our relationship, in our ability to partner with the Egyptian government, whatever it's going to be. And I have to say, it is very important for those listening in Cairo, and for that matter in the halls of our State Department, to understand that the tolerance for this here in the United States Congress on a bipartisan basis is next to nil, and that there will be strong reactions here on both the military and economic front and in every aspect of our bilateral relationship until and unless this issue is addressed forthrightly by the Morsi government and reversed. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
But thank you very much, Mr. Connolly. And seeing no further requests for recognition, we welcome our panelists here today. First, we will hear from Mr. Lorne Craner, no stranger to our committee, president of the International Republican Institute. Prior to this position, Mr. Craner has had a long and distinguished career in public service, having previously served as Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor to former Secretary of State Colin Powell, a position for which he received the Distinguished Service Award from Secretary Powell. He also served as at the National Security Council from 92 to 93 and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs under James Baker. Welcome, Lauren. Next, we welcome Mr. Charles Dunn. Thank you, the Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at Freedom House. Prior to joining Freedom House, he spent 24 years in the Foreign Service, serving all across the world, including in Cairo and Jerusalem. Mr. Dunn has had a distinguished career in public service, serving as Director for Iraq at the National Security Council, as a foreign policy advisor at the Joint Staff in the Pentagon, and as a member of the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff, where he contributed to the development of initiatives to advance democracy in the Middle East and North Africa. Welcome, Charles. And then we will welcome Ms. Joyce Barnathan. Did I come close? Who is the president of the International Center for Journalists. Prior to joining ICFJ, Ms. Barnathan has had a long and impressive career as an international journalist, having covered assignments in Asia and Russia for Business Week and Newsweek. She is the winner of 5 Overseas Press Club Awards, as well as the National Headliner Award, and currently serves on the steering committee of the Global Forum for Media Development. Welcome. And finally, we welcome Mr. Kenneth Wallock, the president of National Democratic Institute, where he has served in that capacity since 1993. Before joining NDI, Mr. Wallock co-edited the Middle East Policy Survey and wrote regularly for the Los Angeles Times. He has served on task forces sponsored by various organizations, including the Brookings Institute, the United States Institute of Peace, and the Council of Foreign Relations. On Foreign Relations. Mr. Wallock currently is a member of the Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid and has served as a chairman of the U.S. Committee for the United Nations Development Program, and our kids are somehow intertwined. That's the real claim to fame. So thank you to our excellent set of panelists, and Lauren, we will begin with you.
Well, Chairman, members of the committee, I want to first thank you for your continued focus on the Middle East and for the unwavering interest and support you have shown to all of us at this table. I wish today's hearing was a progress report on Egypt, but it's not. The Egyptian transition at this point can only be described as a mess, and it's moving in an ever more negative direction. You focused this hearing on American NGOs under attack in Morsi's Egypt, so let me begin by describing how Morsi's Egypt is doing compared to other countries. Political transitions in the Middle East will take time, as they have in other regions. While we must, as Mr. Connolly said, have a long-term outlook, it's also true that key milestones along the way impact the pace, and bad decisions along the way could fundamentally alter the direction of the transition. One need only think of the contrast between Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, and Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia in the 1990s. Comparisons between the speed and scale of reform in Tunisia and Egypt, their revolutions occurred almost simultaneously, are likewise fair. It is true that Tunisia started with a smaller, more homogeneous, more educated population, and that Ben Ali, like Mubarak, an authoritarian, left his country with less poverty and a better economy. But those differences cannot account for Egypt's failure to keep up with the pace or scope of change in Tunisia on issues I detail in my written testimony, from Cairo's failure to safeguard the rights of women and minorities, to placing the executive above judicial review, to significantly less freedom of expression, to the government advocating a harshly restrictive civil society law, to attacks on domestic and, yes, foreign NGOs. Not all Arab Spring transitions have gone as poorly as Egypt. There are worse transitions. Syria comes to mind. But certainly the transitions in Tunisia, and I would argue even Libya, are going better than Egypt's. The shrinking political space we see in Egypt is not a common feature among Arab Spring countries. Going after domestic and foreign NGOs is not a common feature among Arab Spring countries. This brings me to our issue, the Egyptian court's trial and guilty verdicts. I will not detail the saga of the last 18 months. We all know that quite well. You will recall that the charges against us were that we were not registered organizations in Egypt, despite our efforts since 2006 to do so, and that we did not use the type of bank account available to registered organizations. When we last appeared before you, we related the testimony of the person who, as you noted, started this sad saga, Egyptian Minister of Development Faiza Abu Naga, that we were engaged in a neo-colonial plot at the behest of Israel to divide Egypt. This nonsense became an integral part of the prosecution's case in court. Our respective attorneys presented a defense based on the merits of the charges against us, entering evidence and witness testimony about the true nature of our work, demonstrating that the Egyptian government had full knowledge of it, and that we'd made extensive efforts to become registered since 2006. A report completed by Egypt's own Shura Council in 2012 placed the onus of the international registration process on mismanagement by the Egyptian government. And yet, despite an abundance of objective information confirming the weakness of the charges, the trial court on June 4th, in disjointed verdicts, found all 43 defendants in violation of Egyptian law and imposed harsh penalties from 1 to 5 years in jail with hard labor and ordered that our organizations be closed in Egypt. These verdicts obviously have a direct negative impact on our organizations and staff. Moreover, the verdict is part of a broader trend in Egypt. It did not occur in isolation. It is a parallel issue to the current draft NGO law and other discouraging developments I referred to earlier. For our partnership with Egypt to endure, we must have a willing partner. We all understand Egypt is in the early stages of transition and mistakes will be made. And yet it is difficult to ignore the consistent failure by Egypt to make the positive steps towards building a democracy that we see in places like Tunisia or Libya. To overlook the current assault on democracy would send the wrong message. Instead, the U.S. must strongly and consistently support popular demands for transparency, accountability, and freedom at this critical Middle East crossroads. This means a clear, continued commitment by the administration and the U.S. Congress to those working under increasing duress for a democratic Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very depressing. Mr. Dunn.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to appear before you here today. Our President, David Kramer, would be here. He expresses his regrets, but we have a Board of Trustees meeting at the same time and hopes you understand. As you possibly know, I am personally affected by the NGO case in Egypt. For the last year and a half, I was defendant number 30 in the case against Egyptian and U.S. NGOs who work in the field of democracy promotion and human rights. Today, I stand convicted, sentenced to 5 years in prison, and with a fine. Freedom House's office in Cairo has been shuttered. This comes as a shock to me. As you noted, Madam Chair, I spent 24 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, 3 of them as a diplomat in Cairo, where I worked very closely with the Egyptian military. As long as this sentence stands, my ability to travel freely and work in my chosen field anywhere in the world stands in question. 6 of my Freedom House colleagues have also been convicted in this case, and I stand here today in solidarity with them and hope that the views that I express will reflect their views and their situation as well. Now, we had no doubt from the beginning that the raids and the trials were politically motivated. This was confirmed in the explanation from the judges in the case that was reported in the Egyptian press. In this decision, they leaned heavily on worn-out nationalist conspiracy theories with a heavy dose of anti-Israel sentiment thrown in. The explanation said, and I quote, "Funding has become a new form of control and domination, a soft imperialism pursued by donors to destabilize beneficiary countries and to serve American and Israeli interests," end quote. With your permission, Madam Chair, I would like that statement entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. As this decision makes clear, there can be no doubt that politics and not the law was what drove and decided this case. As Secretary Kerry noted in his June 4th statement on this, the decision was clearly politically motivated. So it is now obvious that we cannot expect to find justice through further legal proceedings. The only viable solution in this case is a political one. We look to President Morsi to exercise his powers to wipe clean the slate for all 43 NGO convicts in this case. On this, the U.S. government should weigh in at the highest levels, and we certainly hope that the members of Congress will echo and support this as well. Now, the Egyptian government, for its part, likely expects a return to business as usual once the current furor over the verdicts subsides. Just last month, Secretary Kerry quietly waived conditions on military aid, despite the fact that Egypt is clearly not met the conditionality that Congress has written into the law, requiring Egypt to implement policies to protect freedom of expression, association, religion, and due process of law. As I understand it, the money has not yet been transferred to the Egyptians' account and should not be, in our view, under present circumstances. In many ways, the deteriorating human rights situation in Egypt is worse than it was at points under President Mubarak. So the United States should take 3 clear steps to persuade President Morsi to reverse course and get Egypt's democratic transition back on course. First, the U.S. should reconsider delivery of aid to the Egyptian government until all 43 NGO workers are clear, and the organizations that were closed are allowed to reopen and operate freely. Second, a top-to-bottom review of the U.S. relationship with Egypt, including the assistance package and support for the IMF loan package, should be conducted by the State Department and approved by Congress before any further money is appropriated. The relationship cannot be allowed to operate on autopilot, given the dramatic political changes in Egypt and the region. Third, the U.S. government must consistently speak with a louder voice and at the highest levels about the importance of civic and political rights and condemn abuses wherever it finds them. The U.S. should make clear that it will continue to support funding for the free operation of civil society and its international partners. 20 Egyptian organizations, human rights organizations, issued a statement June 6th through the Cairo Institute of Human Rights Studies, sharply criticizing the verdict and expressing complete support for the defendants in this case. They characterized this as a blow against the democratization process in Egypt. And again, with your permission, Madam Chair, I'd like to have that statement entered.
Without objection.
So it is clear that despite Egyptian government propaganda, our organizations do have willing partners in Egypt, willing to do the hard work of democracy on the ground. We look forward to the day when we can cooperate with them once more. Finally, I want to note that the NGO case has come with a steep human cost to the staffs of all these 4 organizations and others. 13 other Egyptian organizations were raided on the same day ours were, by the way. Lives have been disrupted, careers threatened, and deep emotional stress imposed. To the Egyptian government, the people involved in this case are mere pawns in an internal political struggle. To me, my Egyptian staff members are dear friends and colleagues. I pay tribute to their courage and determination to build a better Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Barnathan, thank you.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me. Can you hear me?
Talk that way.
Sorry, I lost a few seconds there. Madam Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify about the terrible verdict in Egypt. Just as background, the International Center for Journalists' work in Egypt and around the world is aimed at raising professional standards. We offer practical hands-on programs that use the latest digital tools, and we aim to help journalists produce responsible, ethical coverage. When we first learned of the startling charges against 5 ICFJ employees, we worked with our really excellent lawyers to present overwhelming evidence that the allegations were false. Up until the verdict, our lawyers were convinced of an acquittal. The decision to convict all of the NGO workers is a politically motivated move, and it does not reflect the work of ICFJ in Egypt. But I want to highlight the human toll here. This decision is ruining lives. What do you say to a distinguished journalist like Yehia Ghanem, who's right behind me, whom we hired to lead our new program, which hadn't even begun, and to finish the registration process? He got a 2-year sentence and cannot return home to his wife and 3 children and the country he loves without going to prison. What do we say to his children who cry daily because they miss their father? One of his kids had both arms broken in school for defending his father's honor. Our other Egyptian employee who is also here, Islam Shafiq, is separated from his pregnant young wife. Though his 1-year term was suspended, is it really safe for him to return? The court labeled the 3 U.S.-based defendants, Patrick Butler, Natasha Tynes, and Michelle Betts, as fugitives, though they were not based in Egypt and they were not there when the charges were filed. They got 5-year terms. These people's livelihoods depend on travel. Labeled as convicts, will they be arrested and sent to Cairo by a nation that has an extradition treaty with Egypt? There's also the societal impact. Egyptian court officials say they're going to pursue anyone who helped the NGOs, and they want to investigate other civil society groups. As others have mentioned, the draft of a new NGO law, by many accounts, including the State Department's, is onerously restrictive. There is a chilling effect that has frozen the hopes of Arab Spring in Egypt. For ICFJ, this politically motivated decision is particularly painful. We are not a political organization. We do not take political positions or offer political advice. ICFJ has been working in Egypt since 2005 with the complete knowledge of the government. We applied for registration from the start, and shortly before our offices were raided, we gave the government full details about all of our programs. We've always had formal contracts with prestigious universities or news organizations which are registered to carry out our activities. And in 2011, as we've noted before, our lawyer recommended that we open an office, a legal requirement for registration. We had conducted no activities in the office while we waited for approval. At the heart of this matter is a dispute, as we all know, between the U.S. and Egyptian governments over funding for NGO activity. And others have said the Egyptian Minister of International Cooperation was angered that the U.S. gave funds to NGOs instead of to her ministry. ICFJ and its employees were not aware of this dispute. The verdict is full of loaded language. The court claims that NGOs may appear to support human rights and democracy, but the underlying goal is to undermine, quote, undermine Egypt's national security and lay out a sectarian map that serves U.S. and Israeli interests, end quote. The judges also described NGO work as a new form of soft imperialism practiced by donors to destabilize, weaken, and dismantle Egypt. How on earth do we even relate to any of these charges? The ICFJ defendants did nothing wrong by training journalists. We're discussing with our lawyers how to appeal the verdict, but how can we be confident in the appeal process when judges simply ignore the facts? Our employees also risk getting thrown in jail if they return home for an appeal. And those tried in absentia have no legal recourse. Egypt's news media have made groundless attacks on our defendants, and these distortions show precisely why Egyptian media needs ICFJ's assistance more than ever. I think the real victims are the Egyptian people who will likely see further backsliding in democracy and freedom of expression. Members of Congress visited Egypt during the trial and assured our staff there that they had nothing to worry about. The U.S. government would protect those working on programs it funded, they said. We urge Congress now to hold fast to that promise. Please use all means possible to get these unjust verdicts overturned. We need a pardon so that good, decent people like Yahya Ghanem and Islam Shafiq can recapture their lives. It would be a true shame if Egyptian citizens now fear that working to build democratic institutions will only land them in jail. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wallock?
Madam Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify today about the conviction in Egypt of the current and former staff members of NDI, who, along with counterparts from IRI, Freedom House, the ICFJ, and Konrad Adenauer Foundation, were sentenced last week to prison. I also want to thank you and many of your colleagues for the statements of support that you have issued for those unjustly convicted. And we wish to thank as well the many Egyptian civic organizations and political leaders who have issued statements of support. We were all shocked and deeply distressed by the verdict. These individuals did nothing wrong, and they should be praised, not prosecuted, for the work they did to support Egyptian democracy. In NDI's case, there are 15 individuals who have been the victims of this prosecution: 5 Americans, 4 Egyptians, 3 Serbians, 2 Lebanese, and 1 Romanian. It has been an ordeal for all of them, disrupting their personal and professional lives, as a number of them grappled with the trauma of armed raids on our offices, an abrupt work stoppage, an intense government-led media campaign against them, hours of interrogation by government authorities, a dragged-out trial, and now a jail sentence. These proceedings began under the military-led government and were instigated, as Mr. Connolly noted, by a holdover cabinet member from the Mubarak regime. Our alleged crime was operating an unlicensed branch of an international organization and receiving funds from the United States government without the approval of the Egyptian government. While the motivations for the original investigation and charges remain unclear, a central issue was a long-standing conflict over who controls U.S. assistance to Cairo. Those wrongfully convicted were ultimately the victims of an intergovernmental dispute between the United States and the then Egyptian government. The Egyptian view had been that such assistance should be passed through Egyptian government ministries and be used only for programs and groups sanctioned by government authorities. By providing assistance, often through people-to-people programs, the U.S. sought to assist the emergence of a vibrant civil society and political parties whose participation in the country's evolving political, social, and economic development could lay the foundation for a functioning democracy. NDI fulfilled all legal requirements for registration through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2005, shortly after we opened an office in Cairo. And Article 6 of the relevant Egyptian law states that if a registration application is not formally rejected within 60 days, it will be considered approved. NDI's application has never been rejected verbally or in writing. In fact, one government ministry involved in the registration process wrote that NDI's activities complied with Egyptian laws. Ironically, 1 month prior to the raid on our offices, NDI and IRI were formally invited by Egyptian authorities to observe the country's parliamentary elections. NDI's nonpartisan programs in Egypt always responded to local demands and requests for technical assistance. We shared international experiences by leaders who were instrumental in their own democratic transitions from such diverse places as Chile, Indonesia, and Poland. We conducted programs on the development of political parties, and we assisted civil society groups engaged in nonpartisan election monitoring and civic and voter education. If there was any doubt about the political nature of the judicial proceedings, it was dispelled by the judges themselves in a summary of the verdict provided to journalists last week. As been noted earlier, they described foreign assistance, and I quote, a form of new control and domination and a less expensive form of soft colonialism pursued by donor countries to destabilize the security and stability of the receiving countries. This weakened Egypt's position regionally and internationally and bowed to the will of the USA in building bridges to normalize relations with Israel. The judges claim that, quote, one cannot imagine that the USA or any other countries supporting the Zionist entity has any interest or a genuine desire for establishing a real democracy in Egypt. Coming in tandem with last week's convictions is the referral of a new draft NGO law that is being discussed now in the Shura Council, and it is far more restrictive than the one under which our employees were charged and convicted. This should be a time for active civil engagement. Last week's verdict and the proposed NGO law could create the opposite effect. We know that the relationship between the governments of Egypt and the United States is complex and important to regional security. We also know that democratic development leads to long-term economic and social advancement that improves the quality of life, spurs trade, advances peace, and eliminates conditions that fuel extremism. We hope the international community will not give up on Egypt's democratic transition. The issues it presents and Egypt's place in the world are too important. Since NDI's founding in 1983, our staff members, who represent 96 nationalities, have repeatedly overcome the challenges of working in difficult and sometimes hostile environments. but not once in those 30 years has any of our staff ever been charged, tried, and sentenced to prison. Foremost on our minds today are the innocent people caught up in this highly political process. We believe there should be justice for them, which can still be accomplished through legal, constitutional means, including a pardon. In closing, I would like to thank the many members of Congress and officials in the administration who have worked and continue to work tirelessly to help resolve this crisis. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and thank you to each and every one of you. Excellent testimony. Without objection, I would also like to include, for the record, testimony provided to our subcommittee by Michelle Betts, former contractor for the International Center for Journalists.
Madam Chairman, can I also ask unanimous consent to insert at this point in the record a copy of the Connolly-Wolf letter to President Morsi that's been signed, including by...
Without objection.
I thank the Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Connolly. You talked about the personal toll that this is... all of these folks have felt this impact deeply. Your organizations have felt the impact. Egyptian civil society has felt the impact. And seeing as you have experience and firsthand knowledge of what is really happening there on the ground, can you tell us where you think, in a broader picture, where you think Egypt is going under Morsi? Which direction is it headed toward? Is there a chance for democracy left? Is that window rapidly closing? What should U.S. funding priorities in Egypt with respect to supporting civil society, the rule of law, building political parties? What role do you see us having there? And do you expect the pardon to come for all of the folks who have been sentenced? Do you expect the new NGO law to be implemented, to be passed, and that will further restrict your activities? So thank you. If anybody would like to take a stab at either parts of those. Mr. Dunn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As far as where Egypt is going broadly, as Lauren mentioned in his testimony, it's a very troubled democratic transition, which I personally would describe as a suspended democratic transition at the moment. I still have a lot of hope for Egypt. A huge amount of political space has been opened up by the revolution. There are different parties contesting that space. You cannot count out the liberals and secularists whose views, after all, underpin the Tahrir Square revolution. It will be a long process and it will be a messy process, but it does require support from outside, political support and perhaps some aid support, especially for civil society. As you noted, the environment for civil society has become extremely difficult, and just how we can operate there, any of our organizations, as well as Egyptian organizations, and especially in light of this new NGO law, is very problematic. But we're trying to think of some creative ways to engage civil society. Maybe that involves advocacy instead of work on the ground with organizations. But we're trying to figure that out ourselves right now. We have no expectations, our organization does not, of the legal process, including a pardon. We are hopeful that one will be granted, but that's what we're trying to think about right now. Thank you.
And your convict number 40.
Defendant number 30.
Defendant number 30.
I was
yes.
a fugitive at the time. Now I'm a convict. So.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Lauren, would you like to take a stab at it?
You know, I've always said these transitions in the Middle East are going to take 10, 15, 20 years. This is not a very encouraging start for Egypt. You know, and I was just thinking while Charles was talking, if you tried to think of a Central European analogy, maybe you would think of Serbia, where the revolution was hijacked early on in the post-Soviet era. That's not a very encouraging story. I think the issue for us is 5, 7, 10 years from now, when I don't think the Egyptian economy will have taken off, given how it's being run, and Egyptians are looking for new kinds of policies. Will those be available to them? Or will they be stuck with a government that is repressive and isn't producing anything economically? And I think it's important that the U.S. stay engaged, and Europe and others, to make sure that the Egyptian people do have choices if they want them, that it's a more open system. In terms of our particular case, A court appeal is only available in Egypt to people who were present for the trial. And you will recall that the foreigners, at the behest of the State Department, and we agreed with that at the time, left Egypt and were not present for the trial. The only way a foreigner can file an appeal is to present themselves at Cairo Airport, begin serving their 5-year sentence, and then they are free to appeal, to begin an appeal. And obviously that's not something we wish upon our staffers.
Mr.
So an
Wallock,
appeal is not a possibility.
I see that.
Madam Chairman, we're all in the optimism business.
Can you put a little closer to you?
We're all in the optimism business. And ultimately, we believe that people all over the world, and that includes the people of Egypt, want the same thing. They want to put food on their table, they want to have shelter, they want to have jobs, and they want to have a political voice and a stake in their future. And every public opinion poll in Egypt and elsewhere shows that. So I believe in the long term, that will, that desire, those expectations of the Egyptian people will bear fruit. Lauren mentioned Eastern Europe. Let's not forget that 10 years after the fall of the wall, the war in Yugoslavia was just beginning. Milosevic was still in power. That these do take a long time, sometimes generational changes have to take place. But there are elements, I believe, some within the new government, some within the previous led government, and now we see in the judiciary that represent a throwback to another era. And I think it represents Egypt's isolation and this insular attitude. I think that there are elements in the government, elements in other sectors of society that have a very different view. And I just think that we have to stay engaged and support those that want to build a democratic future for the country.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you, and I'm sorry I'm out of time. Mr. Connolly is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I'm picking up on Mr. Wallock's last comment, stay engaged, but at risk of being imprisoned or tried or humiliated. I think you're going to find it difficult to recruit folks in Egypt or from outside of Egypt to want to put themselves at that kind of risk, especially so long as this is unresolved. I will say, I'd like to read into the record, Madam Chairman, this is a shocking statement, I think.
Without objection.
Well, no, I'm going to read it into the record, but this is from the verdict. Quote, the United States and supporters of the Zionist entity felt fear and horror, meaning about the revolution. The United States reacted by throwing all of its weight against this change, but its old tactics could not suppress it. The issue of U.S. funding took on new dimensions in an attempt to contain the revolution, to twist its path, and direct it to serving its own interests and the interests of Israel. That's from the verdict. It is hard to read that statement and to conclude, nonetheless, we're allied powers, that we're partners in a peace process in the Middle East, that we share common values or some basis for common values about democracy and civil society. This statement by a court that convicted 43 people, including Americans, says we were actively conspiring against their revolution, that we were using these spigots, aid spigots, to do just that, and that we were foiled. And therefore, one must at least infer that the convictions are part of their foiling us. That is chilling, and that goes far beyond some misguided instructions to a court in Cairo. And I'm very troubled by it, and I welcome any observation from the folks at the table. And I'll ask one other question so that throw it out there, since all of you mentioned pardon. I am concerned that if we go down the route of pardon, and I take Mr. Craner's point of view, there may not be any other legal options in the system of jurisprudence in Egypt at this time to vacate a guilty verdict. But you go down the route of pardon, you are conceding the basis of the conviction. And I, as a member of Congress, am not willing to do that. I'm not going to put myself in your position. But there is no basis for this conviction, and we must not concede that. I wonder what your thoughts are about that issue with respect to a pardon, those two issues. Quick, we're running.
On the pardon, this is a political problem started by political forces. It's going to get solved, if it gets solved, by political means. The only tool we have in our arsenal now, short of a very imperfect appeals process, is to get a pardon. I don't know of any other options. And I think that a pardon will not materialize out of thin air. As I said, it was a political decision. We need a political solution.
I would just say, Mr. Connolly, that every aspect of this process, from the interrogations to the raids on the offices to the press conferences, statements by Egyptian authorities to the trial, every aspect of this process was a political one. It had very little to do with legal issues. And the interviews that were given by the judges sort of laid bare the nature of the entire process. And this wildly conspiratorial view of the outside world was shocking, I think, for everybody when they read the remarks of the judges, as you did. I agree with you completely that all the people involved are totally innocent, and the question becomes what alternatives there are. And when one is looking for ways in which people are not placed in jeopardy, we're also looking for the road of least resistance, of trying to achieve something that do not put people in legal jeopardy or worse.
Sorry, if we have time, I would like to comment on that. I mean, everybody that I know who works and is a specialist in Egyptian affairs was likewise shocked by the language of the verdict. And so it did come as a surprise to everyone, and it's a very troubling statement, I found. Just the other thing I would say on the legal route, I understand, Congressman, your concerns about the pardon route, but as my colleague said, that seems to be the only route available to us now. For me, I wouldn't have the right of appeal. I would have to go back, go to jail, and then I would get a retrial. The last one lasted about a year and a half, and that is not an appealing route for any of us who were out of the country when the verdicts were issued. Thank you.
Just one last thought on what you were addressing, which was how the judges explained themselves. It's not only the Egyptian judicial system that appears to believe this, but again, I would encourage you to go back and read the testimony of the woman through whom hundreds of millions of dollars of American aid flowed, that the Americans were engaged in a neo-colonial plot at the behest of Israel to divide Egypt. That's literally the person directly receiving our aid.
I should say also the judges claimed that they accepted the validity of her testimony during the trial.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Excellent questions and great answers. Dr. Yoho, my Florida colleague, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Appreciate you guys being here. And, you know, it's hard. I just feel so bad for the people that are in those 43 NGOs that have been convicted. With the Arab Spring and this flowering we were supposed to have of democracies and all this, obviously it's not working. In the old guard with Mubarak, when we gave aid, you could pretty much anticipate what we were going to get, you know, because we'd been had a working relationship with them for, 30, 40 years. But with the new leaders emerging with the Muslim Brotherhood, we don't know the ground rules, and so we don't know how they're going to respond to anything we do. And one of my questions is, and I'd like for you all to briefly answer this, is what do you see happening to the 1979 Egyptian-Israeli peace treaties? If you could answer that real quickly. And then are you recommending that the U.S. should stop foreign aid to Egypt until they release the NGOs? And if so, what effect is that going to have on the NGO members that are there? Is that going to make the situation worse? And then you talked about the success in Tunisia. And why, in your opinion, is Tunisia proceeding favorably when Egypt is not? I'd like to hear your statements on that. And if you could take 30 minutes or 30 seconds on each one would be great.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions, Congressman. They're great ones. With regard to the 1979 peace treaty, when I was stationed in Cairo, I had the opportunity to be in meetings with the defense minister and other senior staff members who later became the rulers of the country. And it was very clear from all of these interactions, and I think is today, that they are totally uninterested in any violations of the peace treaty. They want to maintain that peace with Israel, in part because a war with Israel would be a disaster, and they couldn't sustain it without U.S. military assistance in such a conflict. So I think that's safe. I mean, the Morsi government has made very clear that they want to have some readjustments around the margins of the basics of that peace, but so far that simply hasn't happened. In terms of our recommendations on stopping aid, Freedom House takes the position that aid should be suspended while the relationship is reconsidered with the administration and the Congress, because the relationship has not changed substantially in the last 30 years, but it needs to change because of the important changes that have occurred in the region. And as far as Tunisia, the ruling Ennahda party there is also an Islamist party, but they have consistently taken the view that there needs to be consensus politics in Tunisia. All parties have to be included in the process of drafting a new constitution and ruling the country. That's made for some very slow executive decision-making and a delay in the constitution, but it has also helped to have other parties feel a sense of inclusion in this. The Muslim Brotherhood, on the other hand, is ruling in sort of a majoritarian way. We won the election, we make the rules, and I think that is a key difference there.
Okay, next.
I think on Tunisia, that Tunisia started out with a very strong liberal base. It was a highly educated population. There's certainly, as we saw in the election, a strong Islamist base as well from the interior. But I think there's been a willingness and an understanding that compromise is necessary, as Charles said, that it's not a winner-take-all system. And I think, frankly, I mean, I don't mean to say that Tunisia's paradise right now. It's not.
Right.
They had a political assassination earlier this year. A government fell. But when I was there about 6 weeks ago, I got the sense that people had looked over the cliff, and what they saw at the bottom was Egypt and Syria. And Tunisians kind of looked and said, that's not how we want our country to end up.
Okay, and you also feel that they'll honor the Israeli-Egypt peace treaty?
I understand from news reports that is what they are saying.
Ma'am?
I would just say a couple points, Congressman. First, I would caution against looking back at the Mubarak regime with nostalgia. And I think there's always a temptation to do that. But I think that it was the abuses of the Mubarak regime, including some of the rhetoric, the same type of rhetoric that we have heard today, that drove the revolution. Secondly, I do believe that the peace treaty will hold because I think it serves the interests of both Egypt and Israel. Also, with regard to Tunisia, I think there are two ingredients here. One is leadership, and the second is the understanding that of a coalition government, that there was a need to form coalitions with different political ideologies, and I think that has helped the trajectory in Tunisia in terms of being a more inclusive process, despite all the current challenges that are happening in Tunisia.
Okay.
I was going to just add that you mentioned that we don't know the ground rules, and I'm not an Egypt expert, but I think it's very complicated infighting domestically as well, and how that decision played out domestically is something worth exploring, because the judiciary seemed to take the word of a Mubarak-era holdover as the basis for this trial, which indicates a certain political bent, which may or may not be the political bent of the current government. So we don't know whether the judiciary and the government are also at odds in this thing, and it's very complicated, and it's worth exploring.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Yoho. Mr. Schneider of Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your time here today, but also for your work. A little over 2 years ago when the events started to unfold in Egypt, I think we all looked there with hope and anticipation for a prospect for a new destiny. And what we saw, the work that you were doing, other NGOs, that for there to be that new destiny, they were going to have space to engage. That includes both the physical, intellectual space, but also political space. And I think what we're seeing is that space closing. Mr. Wallock, you mentioned briefly, you're saying it may take 10 years. We heard the comparison to what was happening in Syria. But my concern in Egypt is we're seeing the erosion, if not destruction, of the institutions that are going to lead to the opportunity for a sustainable Egypt. And my question, real briefly, is what can we do to help reinforce or make sure that those institutions are sustainable or survivable?
I would say a couple of things. Number one, on the bilateral agenda, I believe that these issues have to be elevated on the bilateral agenda. And in every meeting, in every setting, these issues have to be addressed to demonstrate our continued interest in a genuine democratic transition and working with friends and allies and in intergovernmental organizations to push that agenda as well and to support what I believe is the hopes and aspirations of the Egyptian people. And I think that's first and foremost. And secondly, I think that there are many groups on the ground that deserve and continue to need outside support. And we have to look for opportunities to continue to support those groups that did receive robust assistance in 2011. And there are groups now that are reaching out and want to be part of the rest of the world and need and desperately seek that type of assistance.
Thank you. And I think this hearing in itself is evidence of that commitment to keep it on the agenda. I have not had the chance to be in Egypt, but my colleague from Virginia has, and I would like to defer my time to him to extend his questions he started earlier.
I thank my friend and colleague. We've been talking about Faiza Abu Naga. What is her position currently in the Morsi government?
She's the wife of the Egyptian ambassador to Japan, and I understand she currently lives in Tokyo.
Good place for her. What's that, Mr. Wallock?
I think she's back in Egypt.
But she has no official role
government
in the current government. Well, that's.
But she has clout. Look at the decision in the judiciary, and these are people with like minds from the previous regime, not the existing regime.
That's right. The U.S. law does circumscribe the $1.3 billion of military aid to Egypt, and it says, inter alia, that the Secretary of State has to certify to the appropriations committees in the Congress that the government of Egypt is supporting the transition to civilian government, including holding free and fair elections, implementing policies to protect freedom of expression, association, and religion, and due process of law, unquote. The convictions last week would seem to nullify any compliance with that provision. There are reports that Secretary of State Kerry recently decided to avail himself of a waiver provision and waive that requirement because obviously it could not be met and proceed with U.S. military assistance. In your view, is that harmful to a resolution of the issue we're discussing here today, or is it irrelevant? Mr. Dunn.
Yes, Congressman, I think it is harmful because it does signal a return to business as usual. Last year, when Secretary Clinton issued a similar waiver, there was at least a spirited public debate, and there wasn't any on this because it was done so quietly. It was issued, as you know, on May 10th. So I think that those kind of signals to the Egyptian government are not going to help with the resolution of this case, and we need to align policy and actual acts such as this with what we're saying publicly about democracy in the NGO case. And so far, I don't see that as having been done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Meadows of North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank each of you for being here to testify. But in addition to that, for investing in a passion and a heart for Egypt, and truly the message needs to be to the Egyptian government and the Egyptian people that really a stable Egypt, not one that is under our control or directed by us, is something that we want, and quite frankly, something that is in the best interest of the entire community, both internationally and in the Middle East. But I look forward to your comments on a couple of different issues. It seems like politically what we've done is we've gotten caught in a catch-22 where some of us, they see us as supporting the Morsi government, or they see us as not supporting the Morsi government. On the ground, I was interested to find out that a lot of the citizens believe that we are very supportive of the Morsi government, and yet the Morsi government seems to think that we're not supportive of it. And in this catch-22, how is that political aspect of that playing into what we've seen come out of their judiciary? Mr. Dunn?
Yes, Congressman, I think you're absolutely right on this. I mean, the U.S. has so far given the impression that it's completely supportive of President Morsi and, in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood. Until very recently, there have been very few contacts between the U.S. government and the people on the ground in the NGO community who are really looking for our support. I understand that that is changing significantly because of the troubles that we've had in our relationship, and there's much better contact between the NGO community and the U.S. Embassy now, which is good. As to the effects on the legal case, it's very hard to parse that out. As Joyce mentioned, the situation on the ground is extremely complicated politically, and so I don't even.
I guess my point is this the judiciary saying that, quite frankly, we don't want to have anything to do with America because you're supporting Morsi? Or I mean, where are we on this? And that's what it appears to be.
I could only add to that there has been a theory circulating, which is credible to me, that the judiciary issued this decision, or the judges in the case issued the decision in part to get Morsi in hot water politically with the U.S. government.
Mr. Wallock?
I have given up trying to ascribe motives to people. I think this is a place where there are a number of different power centers, perhaps each motivated by different things. And to some degree, it's like reading tea leaves. This is a place where the past and present have merged, and people are trying to hold on to power that no longer have it. People that still maintain power but represent the previous regime, and new actors who have never assumed governing authority before. And so it's very, very difficult to understand the reasoning behind language that is being used, verdicts that are being made, or the motivations behind them.
Do you think that the citizens and or the government understand how difficult it will be for Congress to continue to appropriate money and continue to be involved if we're going back home and the people on Main Street are saying, well, why are we giving money when they are arresting people for things that they didn't do? It's already difficult. Do you think that they understand how much more difficult that this will make it on members of Congress?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. For us, I don't want to be evasive. For us, however, we don't take positions as an institution on U.S. aid, and so therefore.
I know you don't. We have to, though, and so I'm looking for where this goes.
but I can't advise.
My time's running out. Yes.
I also don't take positions, but I'm not sure. Somebody mentioned the current furor over this. I don't feel a current furor over this.
Well,
so if there is
it's
in
so
Congress,
new, but it is, and I can tell you that there needs to be pardons, or it's going to be very difficult for us to do anything in a positive manner in terms of our U.S. Egyptian aid going forward. It's just very difficult. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Very good questions. Mr. Weber of Texas is recognized.
Just 5 minutes, Madam Chair. Is that all I get? Mr. Dunn, you said that everyone of those who are specialists in Egyptian affairs were shocked by the verdicts. What does that say about our ability to make accurate assessments about what's going on in Egypt?
Well, I would say, Congressman, that sometimes the analysts are right and sometimes they're wrong. And in this case, I know that we expected, certainly in Freedom House, some sort of a mixed verdict where some people would get off, others would be sentenced. I mean, I think it also speaks to the opacity of the judiciary and the deep political motives behind this trial.
Let me follow that up then, because I'm only going to have 5 minutes. So one of you said, maybe I can find it, that they were a holdover from the former regime, and the verdict that came out wasn't necessarily the viewpoint of the current regime. Was that you? Is it Barnathan? Is that how you say it?
Barnathan, yes.
Was that you that said that?
I did say
Elaborate on that.
Well, I just have to look, as I said, I'm not a specialist in this area, but if you look at what the decision was, the judiciary said they believed everything that this minister told them, lock, stock, and barrel.
Okay, was that the lady that got the hundreds of millions of dollars?
She was the one who got the hundreds of millions of dollars, who was part of the former regime.
And issued an anti-Semitic remark.
Sorry?
And she issued an anti-Semitic remark.
FISA. Well, yes,
yes,
she did. And they echoed her sentiment and basically made the case based on her specious testimony, which had no evidence and no backing behind it.
Okay, and then you said you don't hear a furor over this in your exchange with my colleague over here on the right. Mm-hmm. Are you talking about a furor here in America,
yes,
or are you talking about over in Egypt?
I'm talking about a furor here in America.
Okay, go back home to Texas.
Do you hear it? Do you hear it?
We do. We hear people saying, why are we giving money to Egypt, as well as others. And so I kind of echo my good friend's comments about it's hard for us to go back and do that. Mr. Dunn, you said that the regime is going to go ahead and maintain the 1979 Egypt-Israel peace treaty because to do otherwise would be disastrous. Okay. Do you hold that view, remembering that our record of assessing this accurately is somewhat under suspicion? Do you still hold that view if the Muslim Brotherhood gets into full power and going forward 2, 3, 4 years? Would you still hold that view?
Well, I couldn't predict that far in advance, especially since the situation politically in Egypt is so fluid. But I mean, based on my personal experience working there for 3 years, it is my assessment that even the Muslim Brotherhood will want to maintain that treaty. They might want to make some alterations in its terms, which would have to be negotiated with Israel. But they do not need the military trouble, the political break with the United States, and the diplomatic opprobrium that would come with broaching the treaty or significantly breaking it.
So you're not concerned in the long term, and I hesitate to use the word long term because you're afraid of predicting out 2 or 3 years, long-term implications for Israel. You're not concerned about that?
I think there are plenty of implications for Israel in the current political situation in Egypt. I think my personal view is that Israel's interests lie in a stable, politically democratic Egypt in the long term. I think we should definitely keep our eye on the treaty and what the Muslim Brotherhood says and does on it. I think that's critically important, and their feet need to be held to the fire on this. But at the moment, I am not concerned that they are likely to broach the treaty. Okay,
last question, very simple, yes or no, I hope. There's some jets that we still, is there 4 jets, 6 jets? How many jets do we have holding out there? Madam Chair, do you know that are due over to Egypt? If you had your druthers, Mr. Craner, would you hold up the issuance of those jets to the Egyptian military?
Like NDI, we don't address questions of aid.
Well, we'll give you we won't tell anybody.
Charles.
Yes, yeah.
Congressman, we do take a position on this, and as I said earlier, I mean, we believe that aid to the Egyptian government should be suspended pending a resolution of this particular issue, and really a thorough assessment from the ground up of what the bilateral relationship should be going forward.
Okay. Ms. Barnathan?
I don't feel like I can give political advice on this.
Okay, just an opinion. Mr. Wallock?
Again, I don't want to be evasive, but we as an organization don't take positions on
Okay. Madam Chair, I yield back 6 seconds.
Thank you very much. Those are valuable 6 seconds. I want to thank the witnesses, all the members, the audience, members who were here, the press. We need to get the word out far and wide. I find that even in my very international city, there's a lack of knowledge of what has been going on. There was an initial flurry of news stories, and now it's on to bigger issues, as if there were any bigger issue than freedom, democracy, and the promotion of the rule of law. So thank you for the work that your members do, and we will be working with you to do what we can, what influence we can bring to bear to make sure this issue is resolved in the favor of democracy, and because the Egyptian civil society deserves better. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.